This is the Read, Write, and Create podcast, the podcast where you get a bite-sized session of creative writing coaching from me, Lori L. Tharps. I'm a storytelling evangelist who moved to the south of Spain so I could live a global literary life. I'm also an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction, a journalist, and a former college professor. I created this podcast because I want to help as many BIPOC writers as possible get their stories out of their heads and into the world. Are you ready? Let's go. On today's show, I'm going to be giving you a pep talk about how and why BIPOC writers should use oral storytelling traditions to up-level their writing life and writing practice. And I'm going to be using the life and work of award-winning poet and author N. Scott Momaday as my source material. N. Scott Momaday was the first Native American to ever win a Pulitzer Prize. Let's get right into it. Hello, wordsmiths, storytellers, and scribes. If you're new here, thank you for pressing play, and I hope that what you hear on today's show leaves you feeling inspired and ready to write. If you're a returning listener, you know I want the same thing for you too. And I'm just really happy that you've come back to refill your cup with more stories and lessons for your writing life. So I want you all to know that I selected the subject of today's episode, N. Scott Momaday, several months ago when I was plotting out season 4 of the podcast. I wanted to feature a Native American literary ancestor, and I thought since November is National Native American Heritage Month in the United States, that this would be the perfect time to run this episode. But ironically, the topic of oral storytelling has been organically popping up into my life lately, which makes this episode even more topical and relevant and exciting for me. And I hope it will be for you too. So let me tell you how oral storytelling has been showing up in my life. It's actually been happening in a lot of different ways, which I'm a person who believes in signs and synchronicity. So maybe you won't be as excited as I am about this, but I'm taking notes of how much oral storytelling is coming up. And I really do want to inspire you with this idea that I'm sharing today. And you'll hear more about how oral storytelling has come up. But the most important way and what really cemented this idea for me to make this episode about oral storytelling is because I just returned from my first public storytelling performance in New York City just last month. I was the featured griot at a salon curated by none other than Nicole Hannah-Jones in honor of the release of the 1619 Project, A Visual Experience, which is an illustrated coffee table version of the 1619 Project book. So I was hired to tell hair stories, like to be a griot who shares hair stories out loud. So I told 3 different stories about Black people in their hair, touching on 3 key moments in Black hair history. And I don't want to brag, but I cannot help it. Nicole Hannah-Jones actually posted on her Instagram after the event, and she said that my performance was, quote, powerful. Yes. So I was, of course, very giddy and excited when I saw that. And I really had an excellent time. It was really enjoyable for me, but it was a big learning curve to transition from writing stories to telling stories. It is different. And not only are you orally telling stories, but you're telling them in a way that has to be entertaining. And you're telling them in a way that utilizes the methodology of traditional oral storytellers, not just speech makers, okay? So thankfully, I do have some background in live theater, and I have over 20 years of collected hair stories in my brain, so I wasn't starting from scratch. I also called on what N. Scott Momaday refers to as blood memory. That is the memory of my ancestors whose stories, particularly whose hair stories, run through my veins. But again, I'm not here today to talk to you guys about becoming oral storytellers. Quite the opposite. What I want you guys to think about is using oral storytelling as source material and practice for your writing life. So that's exactly what today's literary ancestor N. Scott Momaday did, and it literally changed the trajectory of his writing career forever. So let's begin at the beginning. Some of you might not know who N. Scott Momaday is, so I want to start with his personal story. N. Scott Momaday was born in 1934 in Lawton, Oklahoma. His father was of Kiowa Indian heritage, and his mother was a white woman who had a great-great-grandmother who was of Cherokee heritage. But when the mother met the father, who again was full-blooded Kiowa Indian, she decided to fully claim her Native heritage and for the most part lived the rest of her life as a Native woman. So that was that. Momaday's father was a painter and his mother was a writer. She was known mostly for the children's books that she wrote. Now, with a painter father and a writer mother, they weren't making money really from their artistic pursuits. So they supported themselves as elementary school teachers, both parents. And for the majority of Momaday's childhood, the family would move around from one reservation to the next in the Southwest of the United States, wherever his parents could find teaching positions. Now, from all accounts, N. Scott Momaday enjoyed his childhood despite the material poverty he often dealt with. He recalls that he was born in a home that had neither electricity nor running water, for example. But he was an only child who had loving, creative parents who doted on him and shared their own creative pursuits with him. He also benefited from the love and teachings of his extended family, his extended paternal family, specifically his father's family of Kiowa Indians. And by the way, I will be using the words Indian and Native American interchangeably. N. Scott Momaday used the term Indian often when referring to himself and his people. So I am going back and forth based on his usage and preferences. Anyway, he said that he loved learning the history and culture of his father's people, as well as those of the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo people that he was often surrounded by, again, because his family moved around from reservation to reservation wherever his parents were teaching. So he was learning the culture of multiple Native communities. And he was also learning how to be artistic. His father taught him how to paint. His mother taught him how to write. And he said that by the time he was 12 years old, he knew he wanted to be a writer. By the time he made it to high school, Momaday had been in multiple schools, and he said he never really was challenged academically. So he wanted to go to a better school for his last year in high school and chose to go to a military school in Virginia. After that, he went on to college at the University of New Mexico, and he followed up his undergraduate studies by getting a master's degree and then a doctorate at Stanford University, where he was studying creative writing and eventually specialized in poetry. So all of this sounds pretty straightforward, right? He's on the path to achieving the American dream, getting off the reservation, making a name for himself in academia, studying American literature, and studying the so-called canon of American literary greats. So he was just on that path, and he was doing everything he was taught to do. He was, getting accolades, winning scholarships and such. But then he had this moment where he questioned if American literature really began in the 17th century in New England as he had been taught. And he started to push back on that when he realized how significant oral storytelling was. And he started to think about the beginning of storytelling in the United States, how it predated anything written, right? Because oral storytelling began with the invention of language. And the indigenous people of what we call the United States were telling these stories more than 2,000 years ago. And as N. Scott Momaday said, that was way before any Puritans set foot on these shores. So let's give credit where credit is due. So once N. Scott Momaday realized this, he decided that if he was going to dedicate himself to learning and adding to the canon of American literature, then he was going to focus on the most American stories of them all, indigenous stories. Now, the New York Times wrote a profile on N. Scott Momaday and referenced an essay that he wrote called A Divine Blindness that spoke on this idea of Native American storytellers of oral traditions from thousands of years ago, starting the American trajectory of literature. And the New York Times is saying about Momaday that he, quote, delineated the long reach of writing and printing in human history. But he added that, quote, in America, there is something else. Momaday called it, quote, a continuum of language that goes back thousands of years before the printing press, back to the times of origin, an indigenous expression, an utterance that proceeds from the very intelligence of the soil, the oral tradition, unquote. So this was N. Scott Momaday's realization. This became the passion of the rest of his professional life. So he did a left turn away from studying white American authors and dedicated the rest of his career to learning the stories of his people, returning to the reservations of his youth, collecting stories and writing them down to preserve what he said was on the verge of disappearing in many cases. So I want to just take a pause here for a second and clarify what we mean when we talk about oral storytelling in the context of Native Americans. Like, we're not just talking about sitting around a campfire and telling stories out loud. According to the National Museum of the Native American, oral storytelling traditions are used to, quote, share histories, stories, and religious rites from one generation to the next. The oral tradition connects past, present, and future and tightens tribal and familial bonds. These oral traditions can provide moral lessons for children on how to behave. They can communicate creation stories, cultural beliefs, and personal family or tribal history and experiences. Moreover, creation stories are often sacred and only told through the oral tradition, unquote. In other words, the oral storytelling is literally the thing that Native cultures use for maintaining the story and histories of their communities. It's used for teaching. It's used for rearing children. So it is a complex and highly utilized methodology of the cultures. The problem is when the language of these communities is lost, then this entire communities and cultures are also lost. And in the United States, language loss was part of the systemic manner of destroying Native culture. When the United States government starts separating children from their families, forcing them to attend boarding schools where they're made to learn and speak English instead of their native languages, you are effectively destroying their connections to their own cultures. And some native languages, because of that, have vanished completely, while many others, while not vanished, are severely weakened by the fact that younger generations don't speak them, don't understand them. This is why N. Scott Momaday, who himself grew up speaking only English, even though he was surrounded by his father's people, even though he was on reservations of different cultures, he spoke English and never really fully learned the language of his father's tribe of the Kiowa or any other native tribe. I mean, he said he spoke some bits, but he wasn't fluent. So that is why he worked so hard to capture the stories of his people and other native people. Interestingly, as N. Scott Momaday is dedicating himself to collecting these stories, he eventually becomes a full-on convert as to the importance of oral storytelling, to the point where he claimed that oral storytelling was a better medium than written storytelling. He would often joke and say, because he was a writer, that he could say without problem that oral storytelling was better than written storytelling. But he said that because those who participate in the oral storytelling tradition, both the storyteller and the audience, they develop better listening and memory skills, and oral storytelling requires the active use of one's imagination. He said, quote, one of the things that I would like to say is that I think that storytelling is one of the great inventions of man. The acquisition of language itself, the oral tradition, which goes back to the beginning of time, begins with the acquisition of language. When somebody calls me a storyteller, I am just delighted. I can think of no greater name than that, the storyteller, unquote. So again, that's what N. Scott Momaday dedicated his life to. Driven by a love of his people and his passion for oral storytelling, he collected and wrote about Native people, for Native people, and for the wider public so that they would understand and appreciate Native culture. When he was writing, He originally concentrated on poetry. He continued with poetry and really saw a lot of similarities and parallels between poetry and oral storytelling. And in fact, as he began his academic career teaching at different universities, he would teach classes in poetry, but he also created his own class on oral storytelling in the native tradition that he taught at all these different universities where he worked, including at Stanford University. And it wasn't until his early 30s, when he was feeling a bit boxed in and confined, only writing poetry, that N. Scott Momaday decided to try his hand at writing fiction. So he wrote a novel, just cause. He was going to try writing a novel since he had kind of mastered poetry at this point. And then he secretly submitted his novel manuscript to a writing contest, but apparently he missed the deadline. But every story has a plot twist. And in Momaday's case, the plot twist was that one of the editors judging the contest decided that even though he missed the deadline, that this was such a good book that it still deserved to be published. So he couldn't win the contest, but he still got a publishing contract for his book. Side note, submit those books, people. You never know what's going to happen. You might not win the contest, but you could still get a publishing deal. Okay, back to the story. So anyway, that little novel, and it was a pretty short novel because, poets always end up writing shorter novels. Well, not always, but many times because they're so efficient with their words. Anyway, that book that was just a diversion from his poetry was called Housemaid Dawn, and it was published in 1968 by Harper and Row. And the story tells of a Native American war veteran who has PTSD. Of course, in 1968, they weren't calling it PTSD, but that's the point, is that he's coming back with the trauma of being at war. He comes back to live on the reservation after serving in World War II. And his struggles to reconnect with his people are culturally specific to his Native heritage, but it was also really universal to many veterans, especially at this time. So Housemaid of Dawn was widely praised by critics, not only for the timely topic, but also because Momaday used techniques of oral storytelling in the book. Now, considering that this was, again, just a little kind of side project for Momaday, you can imagine how shocked he was when Housemaid of Dawn was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. People say that Housemaid of Dawn was the book that launched Momaday into mainstream literary success, and it was. But it also launched what is known as the Native American Renaissance for writers. Now, I had never heard of the Native American Renaissance, but like the Harlem Renaissance, this is the time when mainstream publishers really opened the doors to other Native American writers, thanks in large part to Momaday's success. And Momaday's success really continued from that point on. He did not waste his, 5 seconds of fame. He developed those 5 seconds into decades of literary fame and success. Over the course of his career, N. Scott Momaday wrote more than 13 books of poetry, plays, prose, and children's stories. He took up painting, and at some point he was illustrating some of his own poetry and story collections. He was awarded numerous awards, including a National Medal of Arts, an Academy of American Poets Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and 12 honorary degrees. One of the things that made Momaday's work so highly praised and unique was that he blended traditional oral storytelling techniques with Western or European literary structures. And he did that in his poetry, his nonfiction, and fiction. He said, quote, "I have spent most of my life in two worlds, the native traditional and the modern." So he continued to do that. He was able to kind of straddle the native oral traditions and mold them or fit them into European structures, get them on the page so they could be preserved. By getting the stories down, by incorporating native traditions and stories into poetry, into fiction, into short stories, into children's books, he really opened the world of his people to a mainstream audience. Also, during his lifetime, Momaday served as a mentor and role model to many Native writers, including people like Joy Harjo and Sherman Alexie. And he never stopped being a storyteller in the oral tradition, performing and sharing stories at universities, at museums, at conferences, pretty much anywhere and everywhere that he went. N. Scott Momaday became an ancestor in January 2024. So what do we take from N. Scott Momaday's life, and what lessons can we apply to our own writing life? If you come from a culture where oral storytelling was or is present, I'm talking to you. And since I am talking to a BIPOC audience, I'm fairly confident that your people have stories. Black people, Latino people, Asian people. Basically, if your people are melanin rich, they're probably story rich as well, whether by tradition or circumstance. Really, when you think about it, people who have been forced from their lands, oppressed, marginalized, and or forbidden to read and write, they have often embraced oral storytelling traditions to preserve their histories, secrets, and stories. So if that's you and your people, I want you to do 3 things. 1, capture the stories. This is obviously the most important thing, but I want you to talk to the elders and storytellers in your clan and community and record them. Record the stories and then write them down. Maybe it's your mother or your father, your grandmother or great auntie. Maybe it's your godmother or the woman who lives down the street that everybody calls Ma. Momaday did that with his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, House Made of Dawn. He used a nonlinear circular structure to tell the story of his main character. And interestingly, and this is what I mean when I said earlier that oral storytelling keeps coming up in my life, just last week, we had the author Ingrid Rojas Contreras visit in the Read, Write, and Create Sanctuary. She came to our book club meeting because we had recently read her memoir, The Man Who Could Move Clouds. She told us that the structure she used to write her memoir was based on the way that her mother told stories. Her mother was a master storyteller and healer who would often entertain their family at night telling the stories of her ancestors. And Ingrid said that she wanted her book to read the same way it felt listening to her mother spin her tales outside in the evenings when they would all be gathered around. And so she started to really pay attention to the structure of the way her mom told her stories. And she said it was something like, her mother would start the story and then kind of go off on a tangent and then come back to the story and weave it all together. And so when you read her book and know that this is what she was basing it on, it all makes sense. So use these amazing oral storytellers in your family and try to figure out what is the structure of their story. And then perhaps you will be able to use it for your own stories. You can use it to structure the stories you're working on, fiction or nonfiction. So again, it's a new way to find new structures for storytelling. And by the way, these are not going to be structures that you find in most writing classes, right? Like we have the structures that we study from the greats, from the classics, but here's a different method. Here's a different form of source material to get writing structure from, but it requires paying attention. And that's what Momaday was saying, why oral storytelling is so much more powerful, because it requires better listening, better paying attention. And that's what you need to do when you capture the stories from your own oral storytellers. And number 3, search for the meaning in the stories. As writers and storytellers, our job is to make meaning of the world we live in. We tell stories so people feel comforted. We tell stories so people take action, so people feel empathy, so people know how to survive the unsurvivable. Oral stories passed down from one generation to the next can be valuable roadmaps to the world we're trying to live through right now. So gather those stories and then try to find the meaning for yourself and for your audience. And that can become a new story in itself. Here's a final quote from N. Scott Momaday. He said, quote, "My father told me stories from the Kiowa oral tradition even before I could talk. Those stories became permanent in my mind, the nourishment of my imagination for the whole of my life. They are among the most valuable gifts that I have ever been given." Unquote. I hope these stories about N. Scott Momaday and his commitment to oral storytelling have inspired you to incorporate oral storytelling traditions into your writing life and writing practice. I hope you feel more inspired and motivated to write. If you want to hear more about N. Scott Momaday, there was a wonderful PBS documentary made about him called Words from a Bear. I will leave a link in the show notes where you can find a version of the film. And if you want to learn how to be a griot or an oral storyteller yourself, there are a bunch of organizations and podcasts where you can learn how to master this ancient art. I'll leave some links for you in the show notes. If you're looking for more inspiration and information to optimize your writing life, visit the Read, Write, and Create website. That's at readwriteandcreate.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our bi-monthly newsletter to get writing inspiration and resources right in your inbox. Links for both are in the show notes. Remember, the doors are closed to the Read, Write, and Create Sanctuary, our private community for BIPOC women writers who take their writing seriously. But you can still add your name to the waiting list so you'll be the first to know when we start taking new applications in the new year. The link to the waiting list is in the show notes. The Read, Write, and Create podcast is produced by me, Lori L. Tharps. Our editor is Brad Linder, and our theme music is by Wataboy. Until next time, writers, keep writing. The world needs more BIPOC stories by BIPOC storytellers just like you.